So this is the first of our snippets for this week, which is going to be sort of looking at the militarization of the Cold War. So, 48 through 52. And so if you remember, we ended the snippets for last week by looking at the consolidation of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, and the last countries to sort of move behind the Iron Curtain was Czechoslovakia. And I think what distinguished Czechoslovakia from the remainder of Eastern Europe, and a couple of the groups we were talking about this a little bit in the group sessions last week, is that Czechoslovakia had been a democracy in the interwar period rather than this kind of right-wing authoritarian government. Czechoslovakia had a good relationship with the Soviet Union, both before World War II and after World War II. And Czechoslovakia was a country in which communists had participated basically openly in the political process between 1918 and 1938. So there was this sense that, well, that there was no reason necessarily for Stalin to insist on a communist dictatorship for Czechoslovakia, because it was likely a democratic Czechoslovakia would be reasonably favorable to the Soviet Union. But by 1948, the Soviets are concerned that the Czech communists are weakening politically. It's likely in the May 48 elections, they were going to lose a substantial amount of their support, and the decision is made to go for a coup. And in what is basically the final stage of that coup, the foreign minister, who was the son of this country's first president and founder, is found killed outside of his apartment. And after the Cold War, it's determined that this was a murder, but the official explanation is that it's a suicide. And this is the first meeting of the new communist cabinet, and there's this floral arrangement which is set up for Jan Masaryk, the late foreign minister, kind of as a symbol to the Czech people. Look, we're in charge now, and we're not going to go back. And what happens throughout Eastern Europe in the late 40s and early 50s, if you think back to Soviet history in the 30s, one of the hallmarks of Soviet history were the Stalinist show trials. So Stalin, government, tries large portions of the senior leadership of the military, of the senior leadership of the Communist Party, of the senior leadership of the government, and this approach served a couple of purposes. First, it instilled a sense of fear. If you're a potential rival to Stalin, you know that you have to be really, really loyal to Stalin, because if not, you may be next. Of course, he has an erratic approach. Even the most loyal wind up getting executed. But secondly, the perpetuation of the show trials sends a message to the public that the country is being undermined by internal enemies, and therefore the totalitarian dictatorship is justified in the name of internal security. These two factors stimulate a wave of show trials throughout Eastern Europe, but there's also a third factor at play, which is that in this case, in effect, the Soviet Union has conquered these countries. They've become satellites of the Soviet Union. And so the goal is to use the show trials also to sort of stimulate nationalist support for the communist governments, which means that unlike in the Soviet show trials, where basically everyone was fair game, these East European show trials, which begin in Hungary in 1949 and then move throughout Eastern Europe in the 49, 50, 51, 52 until Stalin's death in 53, disproportionately target Jewish leaders of the new communist states. And the most famous of these are the Czech show trials, again, because the Czechoslovakia in some ways had the healthiest and most robust communist party. This guy here in the photograph is Rudolf Slansky, who was the number 2 person in the Czech Communist Party. Is a ruthless figure. Once the communists take over in Czechoslovakia, he's one of the key people. Trying to imprison and exile, and in some cases murder the regime's opponents. But he's also Jewish, as are many of the leaders of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. And in 1950, the Soviets give an order to sort of go after Slansky, and 14 people are senior members of the Czech Communist Party are arrested, questioned, and then placed on public trial. So this is Slansky at his high point in the immediate aftermath of the coming to power of the Czech Communist Party. Here he is, beaten man, tortured in the run-up to his show trial, at which, and this is always the case in the show trial, everyone always confesses, at which he confesses to be a participant in a Zionist, imperialist, Titoist, named for the head of Yugoslavia, plot, fascist, Trotskyist as well. So everyone is kind of filled in here. I mean, it's a transparently absurd claim. All of the people are everyone in a show trial is always found guilty. In Czechoslovakia, it's an interesting twist in that of the 14 people who are tried, 12 are Jewish, 2 are non-Jewish. The 12 Jews are sentenced to death. The 2 non-Jews are sentenced to long prison sentences. So basically, we have this kind of reorientation within the internal communist parties of these regions, with the show trials basically stimulating anti-Semitism as a way of making these new communist puppet governments, more appealing to nationalist sentiment in the region. And the show trials, as is always the case in totalitarian states, the show trials require a new history to be developed. So Slansky is a key player in Czech communist politics in the 1930s and 1940s until he becomes arrested, and then he's a non-person. So that history needs to be rewritten. And maybe the most famous example of this in Czechoslovakia comes in this photograph. So this is immediately after the Czech coup. The communists have just gotten rid of the democratic government. They've taken charge. And the new premier, the head of the Communist Party, is this guy Klement Gottwald, and he's addressing a crowd. And their work, the communists were, they had some popularity in Czechoslovakia, so he's talking to them. It's a cold day. This is March in 1948. Prague can be quite cold. So the man next to him here, who is the new foreign minister, who's going to take over for Masaryk, the guy who gets killed, is a man named Vladimir Klementis, who is Jewish. And Klementis sees that the new boss is cold. He didn't have a cap, so Klementis gives to Gottwald his fur hat, and Gottwald delivers his address. Klementis is one of the people who's arrested in the Slansky trial and is charged. And this is inconvenient in some ways for the new party, because versions of this photograph had been posted in Czech buildings, in Czech public schools, as as a celebration of the communist revolution. And here we have Gottwald standing next to this person who has now been deemed a traitor to the state. And so the Czech communists just airbrushed the photo. So one day, if you'd go into school, you'd see this photo. And then the next day, this would be the photo that you would see. It's Gottwald alone. The only thing that survives of Klementis is the fur cap that he had given the former leader. And the nature of the totalitarian state here is that even though, as you'd come into school, you would, or, into your government job or anything, you would see the new photo, you would know that in the actual photo, Klementis is standing next to Gottwald. You would have to say that, no, that was not the case, that in fact, it was only Gottwald who was on the stage delivering this address, that there was no one standing next to him. So the totalitarian impulse to control history and to reshape history to meet the current political needs. This is a particularly wonderful example of it, but you see this throughout these new satellite states in Eastern Europe. So basically, Europe itself begins to divide into 2 blocks. So we have a Soviet bloc, which will become organized in an alliance called the Warsaw Pact, which is basically run by Moscow, that includes Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. There are 3 countries you can see here that I've placed in other colors: Finland and Yugoslavia. These are countries that are more neutral in the Cold War. Finland is a non-communist country, but it basically says, all right, We understand that the Soviets are worried about things, and therefore we will agree to a non-aligned foreign policy. In Yugoslavia, the country had been liberated by communist partisans headed by Marshal Tito, but these communist partisans were not affiliated with the Soviet Union. It was a Yugoslav movement, and Tito worried, not incorrectly, that what Stalin actually wanted was a puppet regime, and Stalin actually wanted Tito to be killed. And so Tito, although it remains a communist dictatorship, Tito will live until 1980. The Yugoslavs sort of aligned between the US and the Soviet Union. And then the country that I have here in dark red is Albania, which is also a country which is liberated by communist partisans, not affiliated with the Soviet Union. The head is a former school teacher named Enver Hoxha. Hoxha, unlike Tito, I mean, Tito is he's a calculating figure. I mean, he calls himself a communist, but he's not really doctrinaire. Hoxha, by contrast, is really doctrinaire. This is a fanatical communist regime. He wants a country without religion, so he destroys every mosque in Albania. And Albania also doesn't align with the Soviet Union during the Cold War because they claim that the Soviets are too accommodationist with the West. So we have an Eastern Bloc formed, but a couple of unusual states in Finland and Yugoslavia, and this kind of weird state in Albania. To counter the Eastern Bloc, we have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which originally consists of Denmark. Iceland is then under the control of Denmark, Norway, Britain, France, the Low Countries, Italy, and Portugal, but will eventually expand to Greece and Turkey, and then to West Germany, and ultimately, although not a little bit later on, to Spain. The most controversial expansion, obviously, is West Germany. I mean, the United States had been fighting Germany only a few years before, but by the time Germany is joining NATO, the U.S. has really reimagined itself as a defender of non-communist Germany from communist penetration. And the most famous instance of this is the Berlin Airlift of 1948, 1949. So Berlin, remember, had been divided between the four powers. You can see the map here. But Berlin is entirely surrounded by the communist zone. And in 45, 46, 47, early 48, the Soviets allow the western portions of Berlin to be, supplied on highways. Supplies come in, and the promise is, look, if you're sending supplies into West Berlin, you can't stop anywhere. There is no Berlin Wall at this point. The subway moves between West and East Berlin. But in late spring of 1948, the Soviets cut off road access, and basically they're trying to send a message to the West that, look, it's better for you to maybe move on from Berlin. And in exchange, instead, what Truman organizes is this airlift, where he says to the Soviets, all right, if you're not going to let us supply Berlin by road, we'll just supply it by air. Now, in theory, these planes are flying over East German airspace. So in theory, the Soviets, or the East Germans, in theory, could have shot them down. But Stalin basically was trumped on this, and decides to allow the airlift to continue until 1949. At that point, the Soviets announced that they will resume allowing Berlin to be staffed via roads. But as with Iran, remember last week we looked at Iran and the snippets where there's an initial standing up to the Soviets about Soviet possible intervention in Iran. The Berlin Airlift is seen as an example of, all right, the Soviets were trying to push us out of West Berlin, and we confronted the Soviets, and this is a way of being hardline, and in the Cold War makes sense. The Berlin Airlift is a kind of one-off gesture. I mean, the situation here is a really quite peculiar one, but nonetheless, it's seen as a great victory. And in response to this, the Allies agree to consolidate the western portion of Berlin, which previously had been British, French, and American zones, into a single country called the Federal Republic of Germany, usually referred to as West Germany. And in the first West German election, a right-of-center candidate running on a newly created party called the Christian Democrats, named Konrad Adenauer, who we see here, is elected as the new West German chancellor. And his goal is to integrate West Germany into the Western Bloc as much as possible. Adenauer had been a foe of Hitler. He had left politics as a result of Hitler. He is very fearful of a revival of far-right sentiment within Germany, and he sees that the best way to protect Germany is to align with NATO on grounds that NATO will safeguard against a Soviet invasion, but that a close political and strategic affiliation with Western Europe and the United States will also safeguard against a revival of far-right sentiment within Germany. So the basic story here is that by 1950, Europe has more or less been divided into two blocks, one headed by the Soviets, one headed by the Americans, and the idea of a continent-wide peace seems inconceivable. So that's our first snippet for this.